Africa has reached a turning point. A point the world never believed would come this soon. A point that experts in Washington, Brussels, London, and Paris quietly feared for decades. A point that Europe hoped would never see daylight. Because for centuries, Africa was expected to play only one role: the supplier, the dependent, the resource-rich continent whose wealth powered the rise of other nations, while its own people were told to wait. Wait for development, wait for fairness, wait for a seat at the global table. But today, something extraordinary is happening. Africa is no longer waiting, and Europe is panicking, because Africa just made a move that changes everything. A move that effectively cuts Europe off, economically, strategically, politically, and psychologically. A move Europe cannot reverse. Not with diplomacy, not with pressure, not even with money. This is the story of how Europe lost its grip on Africa, how Africa found its voice, and how a global power balance, once dominated entirely by the West, has suddenly shifted in a direction that terrifies the old world. To understand why Africa cut Europe off, we must go back, not decades, but centuries. For generations, Africa was locked inside a system designed to keep the continent dependent and controlled. Colonial rule may have ended on paper, but the structures, agreements, and economic pipelines remained. Even after independence, Europe continued to shape African economies. Currencies linked to European banks, trade agreements structured in Europe's favor, resource contracts signed under political pressure, and development loans tied to conditions that kept Africa weak and reliant. And for many years, this system worked flawlessly. Europe kept access to African oil, gas, minerals, cocoa, cotton, cobalt, manganese, timber, and more. Africa exported raw materials and imported expensive European products created from those same resources. Europe's industries thrived. Africa's economy stagnated. But something shifted. A new generation of African leaders, entrepreneurs, technologists, and citizens began asking, why are we still doing this? Why are we exporting our future and importing our past? African nations realized that real power was never in independence speeches or international aid. It was in controlling resources, manufacturing, infrastructure, energy, and markets. And that understanding changed everything. Europe didn't see it at first. They didn't understand that Africa was moving in silence, building alliances, rewriting agreements, and negotiating from a place of strength, not weakness. The first signs came in the form of unexpected announcements. African nations began canceling old contracts with European companies. Governments started refusing lopsided trade deals. Many countries began demanding higher royalties and more local ownership. Some nations expelled foreign mining operators entirely, replacing them with local firms. But the real shock came when Africa started saying a word Europe never expected to hear. No. No to unfair resource deals. No to cheap extraction contracts. No to trade agreements that favored Europe. No to political interference. No to aid packages designed to control, not help. What Europe expected to be isolated incidents became a continental movement. Suddenly, Africa was not negotiating from a position of desperation, but power. And this power came from one thing: global competition. Europe used to be Africa's primary partner. But now, Africa had options. China offered infrastructure with fewer political strings. India sought partnerships instead of dominance. The Middle East invested billions in African agriculture and energy. Russia offered defense and mineral partnerships. South America collaborated on manufacturing and trade. Africa realized something simple but transformative. The world needs Africa more than Africa needs any single nation. Europe was no longer Africa's only door. It wasn't even the biggest door anymore. And once Africa understood that, Europe's influence began collapsing like a structure built on sand. The real trigger for Europe's panic was Africa's control over critical minerals, the minerals that power the modern world. Europe needs cobalt for electric vehicles, manganese for steel, copper for electronics, lithium for batteries, gold for finance, uranium for energy, and rare earth elements for technology. And where does a massive portion of these minerals come from? Africa. For decades, Europe believed Africa would continue exporting them cheaply and quietly. But Africa had a different plan. Instead of shipping raw cobalt, Africa began requiring companies to build battery factories on African soil. Instead of exporting unprocessed gold, nations demanded local refining. Instead of sending crude oil to Europe, African states invested in mega refineries. Instead of letting foreign companies own entire mines, countries demanded majority ownership stakes. Europe hit a wall. Countries like DRC, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Zambia started passing laws banning the export of raw minerals needed for European industries. In one stroke, Africa shut down a supply chain Europe had relied on for decades. European manufacturers, already struggling, suddenly had nowhere to turn. Africa's message was clear. If you want our minerals, you must build your factories here. This was Europe's worst nightmare. Africa industrializing, manufacturing, and capturing the value that Europe once monopolized. But the shift didn't end there. Africa moved to take control of its energy. European companies had dominated African energy markets for decades. But Africa began canceling contracts that gave Europeans near total control over oil fields, gas deposits, and hydroelectric systems. Some countries refused to renew licenses. Others nationalized energy assets. Now, African nations were directing their own energy exports and deciding who could buy and who could not. Europe, desperate for energy after global geopolitical tensions, expected Africa to step in and fill the gap. To Europe's shock, Africa prioritized itself and its new partners instead. But something even more dramatic followed. Africa began forming alliances that completely bypassed Europe. African countries expanded ties with BRICS nations, joining trade blocs that excluded Europe entirely. Many African nations began shifting away from Western currencies in favor of regional or BRICS currencies. And Africa's continental free trade area, the largest free trade zone on the planet, reduced Europe's influence even further. Europe suddenly found itself outside the circle. Not because Africa was angry, not because Africa wanted revenge, but because Africa finally had better options. The balance of power had shifted, and Europe had no leverage left to pull things back. If Europe wanted African resources, it had to compete, not control. And Europe wasn't prepared for competition. The final blow came when African nations publicly rejected European political pressure. Europe threatened sanctions. Africa ignored them. Europe withheld aid. Africa shrugged it off. Europe criticized African governments. Africa responded by strengthening ties with countries that didn't lecture them. For the first time, Europe discovered something shocking. Its influence over Africa was not just fading, it was gone. Today, Africa controls the world's most important resources, the world's fastest growing populations, the world's most promising markets, and the world's most strategic shipping routes. Nations across the continent are building solar megaprojects, green hydrogen industries, massive ports, new railways, industrial cities, digital economies, and manufacturing zones. Africa is rising strategically, not randomly. Economically, not emotionally. And Europe cannot reverse the shift, because Europe no longer controls the levers. The truth is clear. Africa didn't cut Europe off out of anger. Africa cut Europe off out of evolution. This is what happens when a continent discovers its power. When people reclaim the value of their land, their labor, and their resources. When nations choose independence over dependence. When history stops repeating itself. Africa is no longer Europe's hidden engine. No longer its silent giant. No longer its raw material supplier. Africa is becoming a global power, not by permission, but by decision. Not through charity, but through strategy. Europe is watching this transformation with disbelief, because for the first time, Africa is making moves Europe cannot influence, cannot stop, and cannot reverse. The world is entering a new era, an era where Africa is not behind, but ahead, an era where the global south is not stepping up, but stepping forward, an era where old powers must adapt or be replaced. Africa has chosen its path, and this time, the world must follow.